between Dudley. A fight breaks out between Dudley and Money, and look at them going and picking him up. Picking up Money and trying to keep Dudley away. Barry tackles Dudley. Dudley is just like this. It's L.L. Carr, and it's just L.L. Carr. So they are going into the stands after the fan.
Addles has come out and worked. Coach Al Addles wants work. Unsel's got Addles. He's pushing him back. Addles won on him. Rick was all over Rick Perry. Addles is furious. Now
and a shocking death caused by a cocaine overdose. Players from the era were banned for cocaine use and the devastating effects of narcotics.
Unfortunately, 1978 was also the first time he experimented with cocaine.
The NBA has been around for almost a century, and the sport of basketball has been around for even longer than that. Throughout this wide time frame, we've seen the game go through countless changes. I believe from the day the NBA was founded to the current day, there have been 6 unique eras of the game. These 6 eras capture the different changes of players, teams, playstyles, strategies, and culture. The era we're going to cover today is what I like to call the Dark Ages, which spans from the years 1973 to 1979. And the era represents the most dull, boring, and uneventful time in NBA history. Serious question. If I asked you to name 4 superstars from the 70s, could you? If you asked this question from any other era, you'd probably get a less hesitant answer. The 60s, you'd have Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, Jerry West, and Oscar Robertson. The 80s, you'd have Magic, Bird, Jordan, and Isaiah Thomas. The 2010s, you'd have Curry, LeBron, KD, and Harden. But who would you say from the 70s? I doubt many people would actually be able to tell you Willis Reed, Dave Cowens, Rick Barry, and Bill Walton. The 70s era just doesn't get talked about as much compared to other eras of the game, and I think there's a pretty good reason for this. There were multiple different problems that plagued the league in the 70s era. One big and kind of unpreventable problem the league faced was the retirements of the league's most marketable superstars. Bill Russell retired in 1969, Elgin Baylor retired in 1972, Wilt Chamberlain retired in 1973, Jerry West retired in 1974, and Oscar Robertson retired in 1974 as well. Even these players' time in the 70s was at a considerably low level of production than their primes in the 60s, which happens to all players, and it was short-lived. Once these prevalent superstars eventually retired in the late 60s and early 70s, new superstars needed to fill their shoes. And one of the main problems of this time is the league couldn't get adequate superstars to fill these legend spots. And the ABA, or the American Basketball Association, is largely to blame for this. The ABA was founded in 1967 and really started to expand in the 70s. The ABA was a more flashy and exciting alternative to the NBA. The ABA has many unique features that grab the attention of many basketball fans. These include a 3-point line, a red, white, and blue basketball, a fast-paced style of play, flashy hairstyles and jerseys, and a more free-flowing approach to the game. What really hurt the NBA, though, was how the ABA attracted some of the game's youngest superstars, like George Gervin, Julius Erving, and Artis Gilmore, just to name a few. The ABA not only took away the viewers and attention of the NBA for a brief time, but it also took away the young superstars, which I would argue was even worse. This meant that the competition in the NBA was watered down. Because of the ABA, the league saw less dominant teams and less dominant stars. And we have statistical evidence that the NBA was a weaker league in the 70s. In 1974, 76, 77, 78, and 79, the league failed to produce a team that had 60 wins or over. This doesn't sound that bad until you realize from the span of 1980 to the current day, we've only ever seen this happen once in an 82-game season. And that was in 2001 when the San Antonio Spurs only had 58 wins. Despite that, the Lakers in 2001 had to beat 4 50-plus win teams to win a championship, something that the teams in the 70s couldn't even fathom. From 1960 to the current day, we've seen the NBA put 17 sub-50 win teams into the NBA Finals. 8 of those teams were from the 70s. The 1970 Lakers, 71 Bullets, 72 Knicks, 75 Warriors, 76 Suns, 77 Blazers, and 78 Sonics and Bullets. Mind you, 4 of these seasons that were outside of the 70s were less than 82 games. To really put this into context, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, and Tim Duncan have a combined series record of 49-1 against below 50 win teams in the playoffs. That means that these 4 legends won 49 series but only lost 1. The loss was Tim Duncan against the 2011 Grizzlies when he was 34. The last metric that shows the lack of talented teams in the 70s was actually something I made in a previous video. The video is called I Found the Best Team Ever Using Only Stats. During this video, I created my own metric to find out how good each championship winning team was from each year starting in 1960. I used many different stats such as SRS, margin of victory, offensive rating, defensive rating, true shooting, and regular season wins. I even used some of these numbers for the team's playoff runs to accurately determine this. These teams right now are in chronological order. The teams in green represent a top 25% team in NBA history. The yellow represents a top 50% team, so above average. An orange team represents a top 75% team, so below average. And a red team represents a comparatively bad team, placing in the bottom 25%. From 1974 to 1979, the league managed to string apart 6 bad championship teams in a row. 5 of these 6 teams, besides the 1977 Trailblazers, placed with the worst 7 championship teams in NBA history. The longest streak of bad teams besides these 6 are the Celtics in 1968 and 1969, and the Rockets in 1994 and 95. Although the other 4 teams from the 70s were pretty good. The 1973 Knicks placed in the yellow category, the 1970 Knicks were an orange team, and the 71 and 72 Bucks and Lakers were both green teams. But there's a reason why the quote-unquote dark age starts at 1973 and ends at 1979. The very early 70s still saw some of the legends of the 60s finishing their reign in the NBA. If we compare each decade to each other, the 70s take last place besides the 2020s, which only had 3 eligible seasons. All of these stats and metrics show how weak the league was compared to any other era of the game. Besides just bad teams, the NBA in the 70s lacked a great dynasty that represented the era. The 60s had the Bill Russell Celtics, the 80s had the Larry Bird Celtics and the Showtime Lakers, the 90s had the MJ Bulls, the 2000s had the Kobe and Shaq Lakers and Tim Duncan Spurs, and the 2010s had the Splash Brother Warriors. This is a big reason why we saw a lack of talented teams in the 70s. Like we mentioned before, the individual stars the league had in the 70s just weren't on the same level in terms of talent and marketability as superstars of other eras. The superstars who won MVPs were Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Dave Cowens, Bob McAdoo, Bill Walton, and Moses Malone. I mean, don't get me wrong, these players are still great. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is widely known as the 3rd greatest player of all time, and he was putting up all-time great numbers during the majority of his career. But I think it's fair to say that the MVP competition was weak. For example, Bob McAdoo is the only player from an eligible decade to not make the 50 greatest players list in 1996. The only other player in NBA history that wouldn't make the NBA's top 75 list, which came out in 2022, is Derrick Rose, who had detrimental injuries that took away his prime. Another example, in 1976, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar became the only MVP in NBA history to win the award despite missing the playoffs, which shows the lack of competition for this award. This may be a little subjective, but these stars wouldn't even come close to an MVP if they were playing against the greats of later generations like Magic, Bird, Jordan, Hakeem, Duncan, Shaq, Kobe, and LeBron. I think we've made it clear that a lack of talent and other competition was a big problem for the NBA, but this is really just the tip of the iceberg. The NBA was dealing with some way bigger problems during this era. The NBA at the time struggled to keep their dwindling and declining viewers interested in the product. During the 70s, other professional sports like the NFL was rapidly increasing in popularity, and the MLB was already an established league that had no problem maintaining their audience. The NBA, on the other hand, was losing its audience left and right. The ABA, the NFL, and the MLB were just better and more entertaining products at the time. In the 70s, the average attendance for an NBA game was around 8,000 people, where the average attendance today is around 18,000. The NBA Finals in 1979 received a TV rating of 7.2, a time where a score of 20 was only good for 30th place in the Nielsen ratings. The NBA in the 70s was a league that struggled to maintain a positive reputation. The NBA at the time was dealing with rampant drug use and fights that made black players a part of the show, and wondered why these issues were pushing fans away. Spencer Haywood, John Lucas, David Thompson, Bernard King, Michael Ray Richardson, and Walter Davis, just to name a few stars that heavily used drugs while in the league. It was so bad that Los Angeles Times estimated that 75% of the league used cocaine and 1 of 10 smoked it. Fights were also very common amongst NBA games. Some of the most notable fights of the 70s were 1975 when Warriors coach Al Attles, not a man to be trifled with even after his playing days, stormed onto the court and tangled with Wes Unseld, and Attles tried to protect Rick Barry after Barry was sucker punched by Mike Riordan of the Washington Bullets. Or what about in 1976? When a fight happened in Game 3 of the Suns-Celtics series, then a fan assaulted referee Richie Powers, who had earlier blown a potentially decisive call, as a part of a wild finish to the triple overtime thriller of Game 5. Or what about in 1977, where Maurice Lucas and Daryl Dawkins squared off in a fight that changed the momentum between the Sixers and Blazers that also brought people from the stands down onto the court. It was fights like these that destroyed the NBA's reputation. To say I was not getting a reaction from potential sponsors would be the kindest way to frame it. Words from the former NBA executive Rick Welts in the ESPN documentary Basketball: A Love Story. He also stated, "If I could get an appointment, it was about 15 minutes of why would anyone in their right mind want to associate with your league." Because of the shambles the league was dealing with during this era, NBA games and even postseason games, reaching as far as the NBA Finals, were put on tape delay as a way to keep affiliates happy. Sometimes postseason games were just not played at all, in fear of the disastrous fights breaking out. During the 70s, the TV deals were so small and insignificant that when the ABA merged with the NBA in 1976, an ABA owner named Ozzie Silna traded his team's absence for a share of the NBA's future TV rights, which turned out to be a very smart decision as the value of those rights grew over time. Finally, the integration of African Americans in the NBA had a positive and negative effect. Although racial integration was a step in the right direction for the league, it came with some setbacks. African American players during the 70s had a stereotype that they were only out there for their athletic and physical abilities and lacked basketball skills and intelligence. The NBA in the 70s also had a lack of African American presence in the front office and ownership departments. Both of these lowered the reputation of the league. If you want to see how the NBA significantly increased its popularity in the 80s, how the style, entertainment, culture, and reputation of the league skyrocketed positively, and how a new era of superstars shaped the most prosperous era the NBA ever saw, I would highly recommend you go watch this next video.